Good evening. Welcome to our study of how to pray. How to pray. Developing an intimate relationship with God. We've been looking at it now for 10 weeks. This is chapter 11 we're going to be looking at out of this book, How to Pray by Dr. Ronnie Floyd, pastor from Arkansas. And as you see here, chapter 11 is our topic today, how to empower your prayer lives. How to empower your prayers, chapter 11. Now, this chapter begins with easily a third of the chapter covering a story that Dr. Floyd shares. Let me share it with you in brief. He talks about early one February morning in 1995. He was reading through the one-year Bible, and that Bible reading plan led him to read about Moses going up before the Lord in prayer in the book of Exodus. He was spending 40 days with God in prayer and fasting. And out of that fasting and prayer for 40 days, Moses came down with the 10 Commandments, only to find the people of God sinning in a great way, which sent him back up the mountain in a period of fasting and prayer again with God. As Dr. Floyd began to meditate upon that text and think about his own life and the things that were going on, he felt a very real burden of God on his heart that he was to fast and pray. In fact, he said, I sensed God was calling me to draw aside to be with him for 40 days of prayer and fasting. Fasting for spiritual revival in America, in my church, and in my life. Now, he had fasted previous to this, but never for 40 days. He said before this, the most he'd ever fasted was, I can get it there, 3 days. 3 days, the longest fast he'd ever participated in before this time. But he began to pray about it, didn't tell anyone at first. Then, as time passed, he told his wife he felt like that's what God was calling him to do. His wife told him she would support him if that's what God was calling him to do. He wanted a specific number of things to pray about if he were to draw aside with the Lord in that time, and so he did. He decided how to kind of lay out what he would do in those times, and he was going to spend 2 hours of uninterrupted time in the morning praying, just in prayer. He would take the time that used for meals normally to spend in prayer. He would interpret hunger pangs as a call to prayer. I know when I fasted, that's definitely what happens. You get those hunger pains, and every time you do, you need to let that drive you to prayer. He decided he would tell no one except his closest staff and his family, and then he also wanted to journal all activity, to hear what God was saying to him during this time. In the end, he said he wrote 100 pages, more than 100 pages, in his journal. He felt himself sensitized to God in remarkable ways during those 40 days. And then he writes about that final day, the time when he broke the fast. He was actually on a trip at the end of those 40 days in Atlanta at a hotel restaurant when he was concluding his fasting and prayer. And as he did, he said he was in his hotel room and just overwhelmed in a unique way with celebration and praise to God. Couldn't believe that God sustained him through those 40 days. And time, he said, was just suspended. He said, that morning as I prayed, I don't know how long, God and I dialogued, but a oneness and fellowship with him was just incredible. He said, the power of God fell upon me with a new and fresh anointing in my life and ministry. I've never been the same. Truly, it was one of the defining moments in my spiritual life. He emphasizes why it's important to fast is because, quote, he loves a surrendered, broken, and weak life. God does. And he realized through those 40 days he came to a place of total surrender, broken like never before. His body was weak. He lost 24 pounds. So at the end, he was so weakened in his body and yet so strong in his spirit. In days after this, he felt the Lord releasing him to tell the church about it. The remarkable spiritual change that came about with him, he felt he couldn't keep it to himself. So on Sunday, June 4th, 1995, he got up and spoke to the church, told them how the Lord had changed his life over those 40 days. It was an incredible service, he said, that day. The service lasted 2.5 hours. No one moved, no one left early. Time was suspended in a sense because the Spirit of God was present. People were on their faces praying even before the public invitation began. There's an incredible brokenness and oneness in that church that day. In fact, he said that Sunday night they met again. They decided as they closed the service, we're going to be back tonight and we're going to continue in a spirit of revival and prayer. And so 70% of the Sunday morning crowd came back on Sunday evening. He put in parentheses, I told you God moved. 70% typically don't go to Sunday evening services that like they used to have. But he said that evening, after 2.5 hours that morning, that evening they had a 4-hour service, a profound evening, 4 hours of true revival. It was past 10 p.m. when they finally closed out the service. He said on June 4th, 1995, the church got a new pastor without changing pastors. And on that day, I got a new church without changing churches. The church, Dr. Floyd, were transformed by what they experienced. His point is that God can do, in a summary statement, let me say it this way, God can do more in a moment than we could do in a lifetime. You've heard that before. And he applies it to this circumstance. Now he writes, God will probably not call most people to fast and pray for 40 days, but I guarantee you that he will call most people to experience specific days of prayer and fasting. You remember as we closed out our study of Lamentations, I simply invited you to fast one meal that day, and maybe many of you did. Ask you to skip a meal that day and spend that time you'd normally spend in eating sometime during that week, not necessarily that day. For me, I believe it was that Tuesday. But skip a meal, fast just one meal, and spend that time in prayer with the Lord, praying for our nation and all that we were going through at that time. And so maybe you did that. And so he emphasizes that fasting and prayer should be a part of our spiritual disciplines. And this calling, though, needs to come from God. How do you know it's from God? He simply writes, you'll know. Maybe God's even convicting you now about the need to pursue this discipline for the first time in your life. And if so, I would encourage you in it. He writes, I want you to understand, though, that I do not believe that prayer and fasting are hoops that you jump through to get God's attention. God is not your puppet. He will not be manipulated. Fasting and prayer are not something others can call you to do, but something God must call you to do. Now, with that, he gives a caveat that a pastor may call a church under unique circumstances to prayer and fasting, as he has done, and he fully understands that. But it's not something your pastor can make you do, your spouse can make you do, some spiritual guru in your life make you do. It's something God must call you to, and if he calls you to it, he will sustain you through it. He writes, I believe that fasting and prayer are God's gateway to supernatural prayer. In fact, he writes this, supernatural power. He writes this in a section. I was thinking about the section. I lost my thought there. But he's in the section about how to raise your prayer to a different level. And this is one way, is through fasting. Well, he then gets into what is fasting, a definition of fasting. Here's a definition of it that Dr. Floyd gives. Fasting is abstinence from food with a spiritual goal in mind. A spiritual goal in mind. Now, it's important that you have a spiritual goal. A reason you're not just skipping meals here. You are fasting, which means abstinence from food. Indeed, you are skipping meals, but you're doing so with a spiritual goal in mind. And there's a lot of types of fasts. He doesn't get into that in here. The Muslims will fast during Ramadan, but they'll fast all day from sunrise to sundown, and then they'll feast after the sun goes down in the evening. That's a legitimate fast. It's one type of fasting. There's fasting of a singular meal or fasting for a day. And as to the fluids you take in, you'll hear Matt Elmore talk of his fast, and he'll talk about water. Dr. Floyd doesn't specify if he took juices in or water or whatever, because you want some nutrients potentially during a fast. So some fast with juices, and that's fine. He also talks about you can fast from other things. You can fast from electronics. He talks about fasting from television, fasting from the social media, if that's important to you. He writes, whatever is important to you, fast from it for a time, and you will see God do something really great in your life. So whatever it is, so you, in a sense, through a fast, you show that this does not have control of me, but God has control of me. So when you forfeit one of those things, social media, electronics, food, you're saying that you are not living for that you're living for God. That's the message you send to the Lord through your fast, that you're dedicated to him above all else. Now, fasting is God uses fasting to do incredible things in our life because it requires humility. It takes humbling yourself before God. Peter writes of it in this way, 1 Peter 5:6, humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he might lift you up in due time. There's many texts that talk about the need to humble ourselves. So fasting is simply one way you humble yourself, to make yourself low, put yourself under the leadership of God in your life. And so in Psalm 35:13 we read this, yet when they were ill, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting. See, David said one way that he humbled himself, and one way you can humble yourself is through the discipline of fasting. Now, the scriptures tell us a lot of other examples of fasting. For example, in the book of Ezra, read of Ezra bringing the exiles back to Jerusalem, and this event occurred at the Ahava Canal. He writes, "There by the Ahava Canal I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves." Again, see the connection between fasting and humility. "But that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children with all our possessions. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayer." They made a safe journey back to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple. Now, what does the Bible say about fasting? There's a few references there. I've given you to fasting, but there's many, many more. Far too many to cite, but I'll share a few with you. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people would fast on the most important day of the year in their spiritual calendar. That was the Day of Atonement. And so we read of that in the scriptures. Also, we've read of Ezra just now. And then in 2 Chronicles 23, you see here on the screen, Jehoshaphat declared a fast for the people. It says, "Alarmed, Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all of Judah." That's the whole nation, southern nation of Judah. And so he led the people to fast. You can read in Nehemiah 1:4 of his fast. Nehemiah, when he heard the bad report of what things were like in Jerusalem, he said he heard these things and he sat down and he wept. "And for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." We're not given the number of those days, but it seems that there were multiple days in which he mourned and fasted in typical Hebrew fashion, seeking God in prayer about the restoration of his home city of Jerusalem. And then you find in Jonah chapter 3 verse 5 that the Ninevites believed God, and a fast was proclaimed by these Gentiles even, and all of them from the greatest to the least put on sackcloth. Again, they showed contrition, brokenness before God by fasting and declaring to God they needed him, and God relented of the judgment that was to come and brought revival to the city of Nineveh. Now, if we move to the New Testament, we see John the Baptist fasted and prayed. Apostle Paul fasted and prayed. The early church in the book of Acts fasted and prayed. You can see that there. In Matthew 6:17, Jesus taught, not if you fast, but what? When you fast. When you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. In other words, he assumed his followers would continue the spiritual discipline of fasting. Now, you may remember there was a time Jesus and some of his closest followers were on the Mount of Transfiguration. And there, Peter, James, and John, and he had an intense encounter with the transfiguration of Christ. It was a meaningful time. And then they came down from the Mount of Transfiguration. And you may remember this. They came down and they were not able to cast a demon out of this boy. The other disciples, not Jesus, Peter, James, and John. They came down. The other disciples weren't casting the demon out. And they were frustrated. And they said to Jesus, "Why are we not able to cast this demon out?" Jesus did. Boom, like that. Cast it out. And he said to them this. He said, "This kind comes out only through fasting and prayer." Matthew's gospel doesn't mention that, but Matthew's gospel mentions that Jesus said that they needed faith as small as a mustard seed and nothing would be impossible. But in a parallel text to that, I think it's in Luke's gospel, he says that also they needed to fast and pray. So the Bible's full of illustrations about fasting and prayer. He believes, Dr. Floyd writes, that he thinks that fasting is so disregarded and ignored by Christians today is because of Satan. Satan knows the power of fasting, and so he does everything he can to keep you and me from it, to keep Christ followers from fasting, that they might see the power of Christ unleashed in their lives through fasting as they pray. Now in Matthew 6, people asked the question, should a person talk about their fasting? Well, not while they're fasting. Remember, Jesus said this in Matthew 6, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they've received the reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who's unseen. Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." We won't get into the point of the fasting and the specific practical aspects of oil and so forth. The point is, you don't announce that you're fasting. You don't make a big deal of it if you're fasting. However, in like Dr. Floyd's case, after you've fasted, God may lead you to tell others about the fast. After all, if they didn't, we wouldn't have some of these scriptures I've just read to you. We wouldn't know about Moses on Mount Sinai and fasting there before the Lord. we wouldn't have that down. So obviously, in some cases, the Lord releases those who have fasted to bear witness to what God did in their lives through the time of fasting. Now, he writes about the power of fasting. He writes this: fasting is powerful because you neglect the flesh and its natural desire of eating in order to appeal to God to do something supernatural in your life. So you're denying the natural desire of eating to see God do something supernatural. And you're communicating that to God, not just with words, but with your actions. You're telling God, I want to pursue you above all. And in this section on the power of fasting, Dr. Floyd even writes how he knows of people, and he himself has experienced being set free from sins that had enslaved him, some kind of bondage. And yet he found and has found people to be set free from that during a period of fasting. That's how powerful it is. So if you found yourself bound in certain sins, maybe you should consider the spiritual discipline of fasting. He writes, in my days of extended fasting and prayer, God has set me free from sins that had plagued me for years. Extended times of fasting make you aware of the holiness of God and the exceeding sinfulness of yourself. God has used fasting to break the chain of sin in my life, and I know he will do the same in your life. Why? Fasting empowers your prayers with real God power. Now, he then takes on the question of when should you fast and pray? When should you fast and pray? And he cites a number of examples. You'll hear Matt talk about those in his life in our interview, but it might be a desire for a fresh touch from God to do something new and fresh in your life. And maybe to pray for your church. Maybe they're going through a particular issue, a crisis. Maybe you don't have a pastor, and so you're praying about that big decision that looms before your church. It might be your country is going through turmoil or hardships or difficulty. You desire an awakening in your country. And so you want to fast and pray to bring that about, whatever country you might live in. And so these are all reasons to fast, and you can find many more. For me personally, it's often been in times of big decision making, life-changing decisions before me. And so that's when I've often fasted and prayed so that I would sense the leadership of the Lord in that decision making. He writes also, I believe another time you should fast and pray is when you're desperate for God to do something supernatural in your life. So obviously that could occur at any time. His point being, there should be a sense of desperation when you're fasting in prayer. It's an extreme step you take, and you're saying something strong to God through your fasting and prayer. Now, he gives some helpful hints about when you fast and pray. Helpful hints about when to fast and pray. And there's just 4 of them. First, you want to discover God's plan. He has a specific reason that he has you fasting and praying. When God puts that on your heart to fast and pray, you should have that spiritual goal in mind. And so as you prepare to fast, you should maybe even write that out. What is it I want God to teach me or do in my life through this fasting? He says, write down those things you sense God wants you to pray for during the time of fasting. So write those down. Could be prayer burdens. Again, it could be decisions you're making, etc. He writes, for example, if your fast is for one day, define 3 or 4 spiritual goals that God might bring about in that one-day fast. If it's a longer fast, you might have more goals. So secondly, that leads right into the next point. You need to determine the length of your fast. Is it one meal? Is it one day? Is it sunrise to sundown? Is it a 24-hour period? Is it 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, etc.? Determine that length before you fast and then begin the fast. The magnitude of your need should determine the length of your fast. The magnitude of your need should determine the length of your fast. A third point of advice is to withdraw. Withdraw. You want to have some time when you're fasting and praying, not just to be in your regular routine. You want to have a place to be able to pull away privately, to spend some intimate time with the Lord, even if that's just a prayer closet in your house. But if you can get away from your home to a different environment, if you can get away to a private place, you want to seek to do that. Withdrawing is important. He writes, if your daily time with God is normally 30 minutes in length, then make it 60 minutes the day you fast. You can turn normal time allotments set aside for meals into times for prayer and communion with God. Finally, his final helpful hint is to journal. He believes it's important to write down your thoughts in the journal, all your thoughts. And so it's important to do that. And so whether you type out a journal or whether you have a handwritten journal, you want to write out some things that God is teaching you during the prayer time as you spend time in his word, as you spend time in prayer with God. Dr. Floyd closes the chapter by saying this. Truth be told, when it comes to fasting and praying, you need to remember you only have 4 problems. 4 problems. Let me show them to you. Maybe not what you think. He says, your mind, your will, your emotions, and your body. All those may resist the thought of fasting. He says, your mind races away at times when you pray and thinks about things that are not holy. Your will stands up periodically in opposition to God's will. Your emotions are like a roller coaster at times, measuring the ups and downs of your life. And your body is deteriorating every day, regardless of your commitment to fitness. Then he uses this illustration. He says, have you ever witnessed an orchestra conductor exercise his influence upon the orchestra? It's amazing. Whenever he lifts his arms in a single motion, all the various members of the orchestra, each playing different notes in rhythm. First, as he raised his arm, they all raised their instruments, if you've noticed that. Then he writes, although various members of the orchestra are each playing different notes and rhythms during the warm-up, once the conductor lifts his arms, they're immediately prepared to follow his direction. Have you heard that? The kind of a cacophony of sound as they're tuning up before they start the song. And then once they start the song and he begins to conduct, wow, it's beautiful how they sound harmonious and all the instruments blend together. Well, guess what? He writes, when you fast, your spirit becomes like an orchestra conductor. Your spirit is connected in supernatural oneness with God. And it calls to attention your mind, your will, your emotions, and your body. All of them come into alignment as they submit to what you in your spirit are telling them to do. And through this experience, your mind becomes the mind of Christ. Your will is aligned to God's will. Your emotions reflect the emotions of Jesus. Whatever he loves, you love. Whatever he feels, you feel. Your body, that weak, though through fasting, is made strong by God's supernatural intervention. Anyone or all of those 4 problems can be restrained during times of fasting and prayer. You do not have a single problem, at least of these 4, that God cannot solve. And it's true to all the problems of your life. I think it's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. Have you? Your mind, your will, your emotions, your body, sometimes they all are a problem. They all can lead you to resisting the very will of God. Well, I don't know if God's will for you is to fast and pray after this recording, perhaps sometime soon, maybe this week, maybe this month, maybe at some period this year. You're going to be called by the Lord to fast and pray. I pray as you do, you'll experience some of the sweet rewards he speaks of in this chapter. You will experience them within your person, and your faith will be jettisoned forward. He writes that fasting will definitely take your prayer life to a new level with God. Now, this chapter has been about the 5th of 5 practices to pray at the next level. By way of review, let me say them to you. To call upon the Lord. Remember, crying out to him, even speaking loudly, shouting to him in prayer. That'll take your prayer to a new level, Dr. Floyd urges. Secondly, pray it through. Remember, persevering in prayer. We see that Jesus taught that. Praying it through. Don't stop praying for something. That's evidence of your faith, not a lack of faith when you pray it through. Third, to intercede. That is praying for others. We interviewed the Unswetas that night. We talked about the importance of intercession. And then warfare praying. We talked about that with the Plumleys, warfare praying. And hopefully that was helpful for you to think about your prayers as part of our spiritual warfare against the evil one. And then today, empowering prayers by fasting. We hope that you will empower your prayers by entering into that spiritual discipline. There's 5 practices to pray at a new level. Next week, I'm going to talk about some barriers to prayer. We're going to look at 3 in the 3 coming weeks. But now let me talk with Matt Elmore, interview him, that you can learn from his experiences of fasting and prayer. Well, now we come to the interview portion of this evening's teaching on how to pray by Dr. Ronnie Floyd. This evening, I'm privileged to be joined by my friend, minister of the gospel, missionary to East Africa, Matt Elmore. Matt, we're going to do this by Zoom, and right now people hopefully are looking at your image of you, that same image I'm looking at on the TV screen they're looking at through the camera. And we want to ask you some of the questions tonight about, particularly about your prayer life and about even fasting a little bit. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. Well, let's get started. First, just maybe tell us about your prayer journey. You're how old now?
37 as of Wednesday.
Man, old man, 37. So I'm sure your prayer life has changed over your 37 years on the earth. Maybe tell us a little about what that prayer journey's been like, and maybe even how it's changed in your time in serving the Lord on a mission field.
So for me, like currently, what I do to help myself pray is I'm not really good at just sitting in a chair, for example, bowing my head and praying. I just feel like I get too distracted. So what I personally do is I type my prayers on the computer, like almost like I'm writing a letter to God. Generally, the way it starts out is I'll read my Bible, find some couple things that are in there, just maybe kind of break the scripture apart a little bit, find some clear application points for me and for my life. And then what I do is I'll pray through those action points. Like, let's say, for example, it's Matthew 6:25, like, do not worry, about what you eat, what you wear, etc. Now I'll kind of say, Lord, today I'm reading about not worrying. And I'll just kind of talk to the Lord about it. And it's interesting to me how as I'm kind of going through that and in some ways kind of processing some thoughts, I feel like the Spirit of God just kind of give me something a little bit more to kind of elaborate on, maybe pinpoint some things a little more specifically as I kind of pray through that particular scripture. And then as I'm doing that, then I'll just kind of find myself moving to some prayer requests that I may have, or praying on behalf of some other people or some other things that are going on. So that's generally how my prayer life, I guess you could say, is. And I tend to do that in the mornings. Before Ezekiel, our little boy, I would say generally I didn't really put a time limit to that prayer, Bible/prayer time. I would just kind of go until I just felt like it was done. But it's been a little more difficult, now with a little boy. So I've had to be a little more regimented and be a little more concise, I guess you could say, with some of that, and find myself, even I had a pastor friend that just encouraged me. He said, hey, listen, if you just feel like you just haven't prayed enough and you just don't have time to pray, he said, just say, Lord, have mercy on me. He said, just go through your day
Covers
and
it all.
Lord, have mercy on me. Lord, have mercy on me. You just keep, just make that kind of a mantra. And so I would say that's kind of been a shift from before fatherhood to now after fatherhood, some of those things.
A rowdy little boy may make you cry that out.
Yeah,
Lord have mercy
exactly.
on me.
And may have Lord have mercy on him, right?
Maybe that too, yeah.
So don't hurt him.
Yeah. So now let's talk about this typing thing, because that's very interesting. Nobody's said that yet in the 10 interviews we've had before. So you're saying you have trouble with focus, but typing it out really helps you focus. And then really don't those prayers then become a journal for you as well?
Yeah, you could say that it kind of becomes like a journal. And, I'll put for example, the date, let's say it's June 10th, 2020. And then what I'll do is I actually have some documents of my prayers from even 5-6 years ago.
Wow.
That I can go back and see, prayers throughout the year. Sometimes it's difficult to go back, to find some of those things. If I feel like it's a really significant day or something, then I'll try to make that like a different color. So it's easy for me to go back and recall that for like some special memory or something big that I felt like happened. So those are some things that I try to do. So typing has really helped me because I'm, in some ways I'm like my father. I don't think my dad gets real distracted pretty easily. And I think I'm a lot like him in that way. And if I'm actively doing something, like even just moving my fingers, I feel like I'm personally a lot more engaged.
Yeah, that's a great advice, because there's a lot of you out there that are maybe type A personalities or a little hyper like I am, and that gives you something active to do. So prayer walks are another way, if you're an active person, to do your prayers while you're walking. A lot of different ways, but this is a great one. Type it out. That's great advice, Matt, about prayer. And for you as a missionary, we interviewed the Plumleys last week, I'll tell you that. Served overseas for 12 years, and you've been overseas how long?
It'll be 12 years, and on July the 4th, it'll be our anniversary.
So you're stateside now, but you've been over there in East Africa for a dozen years. Are the prayers of a missionary different? Do you pray differently on the field than you did in the States? Is that a fair question to ask?
I mean, in some ways, not in some ways yes, in some ways no. I guess the biggest, transition for me from being a missionary to like not being a missionary is, I'm living, quote, on faith, in the sense that I'm trusting in God to provide for our needs through our support raising and stuff, and so I can be a little more, dependent, I guess you could say, on God and some of those things. But all that, I pray for my son's salvation. I pray for my wife and I, with various things we're going through, and pray for the people I work with. I feel like those are, things that anybody would pray about. But yeah.
Sure. So this chapter today we've looked at, chapter 11, and how to pray, is about empowering your prayers, particularly empowering your prayers through fasting. And so I knew you'd fasted some, sought you out by a phone call to set up this interview today. But could you talk to us about fasting? And I am curious, 12 years you've been there, did you have fasting as a spiritual discipline before you were on the mission field, or is this all your fasting been on the field? Can you talk to us a little about how fasting has been a part of your prayer life?
So fasting, I would say, and I read this before, fasting is kind of like an atomic bomb, I guess you could say, for your prayer life, in the sense that, it's you need one big bang. When there's been times in my life where I just did not know what to do, times where I just thought, what do I do next? I'm just totally lost, God, and I need you to break through. And so those have been times where I've fasted, and I'll kind of give you some examples. There have been some very clear-cut times where I've done that on the mission field, even before I went to the mission field.
Okay.
One was during our calling to go on the field, I felt very strongly that I needed to go. That God was calling us, Kelly and I, to go to the mission field. And she and I went on a short-term mission trip there. And she said, while we were there, she cried every night we were there, because we were going there just for her to view it, to kind of have like a visionary trip to see if what's life going to be like. Every night we were there, she cried, and she said, I will never move to this God-forsaken country. And that is a direct quote from her. And she's totally changed from that moment, but that was hard for me. So when I came home, I really had this burning passion in me to go, but my sweet wife, who I just married, just said no. And so I left her alone. I didn't talk to her. And I prayed. I would get up late at night and pray and hammer keys on my keyboard, and just kind of like, God, I feel this way, but why should she feel this way? And we had to raise support. We had 1 year from that visionary trip to when we were going to go on the field, and we had to raise some support. So we got within 5 months before we were supposed to leave, and I haven't raised any support. And I just remember that around that 5-month mark, I said, God, I got to take this up a notch. So I started fasting. I said, I'm going to fast until I get a solid answer from her. And all the time, I'm not talking to her about it, but somehow women know. They just know. So I would be near her during breakfast or lunch, but dinner I would be. So I ate dinner, but breakfast and lunch, I did not eat anything. I just drank water. And I just prayed, God, I feel that you're leading me to go. I feel it burning in my heart. Kelly's not ready to go. And so I'm just praying and asking that you would move her. After 2 weeks, she came to me with her Bible open to a verse in Psalm 32, verse 9, which says, do not be like the horse or the mule, which need to be turned by a bit or bridle. Now, a little out of context, but I feel like God really used that to get her, to move her. So she came to me and said, Matt, let's go. Wow. And like I said, I didn't do that. I didn't talk to her about it at all. It's just the Lord did. Mm. And then on the mission field, I was there for the first 3 months, and I remember I didn't know what to do. I had no mission agency to kind of receive me. I didn't really have anybody to give me direction. I didn't know what to do. So after 3 months, I fasted. So I'm going to fast for 3 days. So I fasted and drank water only for 3 days. And towards the end of that 3 days, I had a friend call me, a Kenyan friend call me and say, hey, Matt, I want you to come and do some training for some local youth pastors in Nairobi. I'm thinking about hiring them. And so I did that for 1 year. And then after 1 year, this mentoring and training I did for those youth pastors, the bottom just fell out. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was next. And so I started fasting again. I fasted this time for like 5 days. And towards the end of that 5 days, I didn't know what to do next. The children's pastor at Ridgeway's Baptist, it was Pastor Dan. He came some years back. Pastor Dan gave me a pen and said, hey, will you take this to the senior pastor? So I walked in the senior pastor's office and, hey, here's Pastor Dan's pen that he borrowed. He goes, oh, thanks. I said, Matt, have a seat. I want to talk to you. So I sat down and started talking to our Kenyan senior pastor, Pastor Wanje, and he said, tell me what's going on. So I told him, hey, this one thing I've been doing for the last 1 year, it's just completely died, and I don't know what to do next. He said, well, tell me what's going on. So I told him, he said, hey, you know what, Matt, I know your goal is to equip churches to reach youth. He said, why don't you go and start training at the local seminary here, the Kenya Baptist Theological College? And I said, that's a great idea. I never thought of that. So I went there and started teaching. As I started teaching, that's when I got invited to start teaching conferences and started teaching at other seminaries. And I started meeting the guys that I currently work with, some of my staff, like Sammy and Simeon, Zephaniah, some of the other guys that were there. And they were the ones that I started, teaching conferences with. And it was really so as you look through my history, from my calling to Kelly's and, and all these other things, and there's other stories I could share with you. There was one time where our finances literally went to zero, and I didn't know what to do. And I just said, maybe we go home or maybe we stay. And so I fasted for 10 days, solid, just begging the Lord, saying, what do I do, God? And just felt the Lord say, just keep staying on, just don't worry about it. And I had a specific amount that I was hoping to raise. And I prayed a specific number. And what was incredible was we came home for 3 months and I was raising support, and it was terrible. I had a little science board. I mean, I had like a cheap letter that I gave to people, and it was terrible. I don't know how anybody had confidence in us to support us. But that exact number is the number that God started coming in every single month.
Wow.
And then it happened again the following year that our ministry just exploded after that year. And I had to raise a specific target, one I was hoping to hit. And I prayed and fasted again for that for another like 4 or 5 days. And then that number started coming in. So there's been a lot of times in my life to where it's just kind of like, I need you to come through, or I don't know what to do. Open a door. And I just fast through those times of fasting, God has answered those prayers.
Yeah, so that's really good because Dr. Floyd makes a point in the chapter of emphasizing you need to have a plan and a purpose for your fast. There should be a specific reason you are fasting and then a plan to go about it. Now, he I don't know if you know this, he in his chapter talks about he fasted 40 days, lost 24 pounds, so incredible. So you said, though, you fasted up to 3 and then 5 days, right?
The longest I've ever gone is 10 days.
10 days?
Yeah,
Wow,
10's the longest I've gone.
Okay, 3, 5, 10. Wow, that's amazing.
Because I remember reading, I think it's Donald S. Miller wrote a book on spiritual disciplines for the Christian life, and he talks about fasting.
Okay.
And one of the things he talked about is, don't if you've never done fasting before, don't start doing like a large number of days.
Sure. Yeah.
You start with one, and the next time you do it, then increase it, and then increase it, and then increase it. So I think for me, it was like when I did like a fast with just water only, it was 1 day, then it was 3, then it was 5, and then 10.
Yeah. Dr. Floyd doesn't give the whole chronology of his fast. I imagine he had a lot of other shorter fasts working up to that, but it was striking. I don't know of any other human actually that's ever done 40 days, but Jesus obviously be the other one comes to mind. Well, let's talk about this pandemic now. We're in a pandemic. You're back here stateside up in the Ocala area, so you experienced it over there a little bit in Kenya, and then you came here, had a self-quarantine, so you know about it in that way that maybe some of us haven't self-quarantined. So let me ask you, how has the pandemic influenced your prayer life, and then even these more recent events here in America with the George Floyd death, and then the protests, and even riots and lootings and all? So a little bit of turmoil in the U.S., your homeland you've returned to after really only coming here for brief stays. You're here a little bit longer this time. How is that all of that impacting your prayer life and maybe that of your family?
In terms of the pandemic, I guess you could say I don't really feel like tons change as far as my routine goes, but maybe some of the things that I prayed for is just like I'm just kind of in awe of the power of God to kind of spin some things on its head and make a worldwide just like total change.
Yeah.
And just kind of, I guess you could say I've dug in a little bit more and just thinking about the sovereignty of God and just kind of how he's in charge and in control, just kind of thinking about that a little bit more. In terms of the George Floyd thing and kind of what we've been seeing there, I guess you could say some of the things I've realized is I've done some reflecting and thinking of my life. Like, for example, I heard an interview with like Tony Evans, for example, on Moody Radio and talking about some things and some other Black pastors that were really some wonderful things to say. And one of the things like that I heard like kind of a common theme was, weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. And one of the things that I repented of, truthfully, in my prayer was I was really quick to, in general, to kind of point out some of the flaws that you could say with some of the Black community things. Like, for example, it was easy for me to point out the statistics. Like one example could be that there's more Black men are died through other Blacks shooting them as opposed to policemen, for example. And that's a true statistic. You could even point to some of those single parent households, some of the challenges that come with that. But I felt like that's not the right way to respond to these sort of things, even though those might be true statistics. It'd be kind of like, for example, if Pastor Scott, you're my friend, and let's say that you're hurting because of something that's happened to you, then I start naming all of the flaws that you have in your own life that's led to, your difficulty that you've had, or that's a piece of the difficulty you've had. And I just don't think that's just not the right way to respond. The right way to respond is weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. Have compassion on those who are going through difficult times. And so I realized that was wrong in me, and I needed to repent and refocus on those sorts of things. And so I guess that's kind of been where some small things. I guess you could say that's been some big reflections on me, and that I need to rethink that.
Sure. But do you feel, I guess, kind of what I want to see then, that's great in a kind of wider commentary, but how about your prayer life? Is the anxiety that these events may have created, maybe they're not affecting you in that way, but they've made a lot of people anxious, so it's driven some people to a whole lot more prayer, maybe a more intense prayer, maybe more frequent prayer, because of the level of concern over first the pandemic, and now the pandemic's returning. I mean, now we're seeing a huge uptick this week that we're recording this in Florida and other states as well. And so there's a lot of concern. Here we think we're maybe flattening the curve, we're maybe knocking this thing down in the summer, and yet it's continuing on, and there's, of course, warnings about it coming back in the fall, but frankly, it seems like it's coming back now. It's never really left. And so a lot of people seem to go up and down in their prayer lives and the intensity of it in relation to the pandemic in particular, but these other national events as well. I guess what I'm wondering, are these national events, are they impacting your prayer life in either how you pray, intensity of prayer, anything like that?
For me, like I guess you could say yes, in some ways, they have, kind of helped intensify my prayer, and in some ways, just kind of praying and thinking about the pandemic and other things that are going on in our country in general. And even just, Kenya's also, there's a lot of challenges that Kenya's even had through all this. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think is, to kind of think through some of the Psalms, for example, is it seems that the psalmist uses the stress or uses the difficult things to press more into God, and we need you. And mm-hmm. and I think it's okay but sometimes I think too, like, we get the mentality that if I ever feel any stress or if I ever feel any sort of kind of like I'm really like struggling in some sort of a way, that I'm just less of a Christian.
Right.
And it's okay to feel grief. It's okay to feel these things, but I think you got to use those things to press more into the Lord.
Yeah.
I think it's not okay to ever stop rejoicing in Jesus. I think I think it's a problem if you ever stop thinking, well, yeah, the gospel's great and all that. That's a problem. But I think you can use the grief and those things that press in. Like this morning, Kelly and I were texting back and forth we're talking about Psalm 60. And this morning in particular, I felt was really kind of grieved, I guess, with just a lot of things going on. And Psalm 60 says this: "O God, you have rejected us, broken our defenses. You have been angry. Oh, restore us. You have made the land to quake. You have torn it open. Repair its breaches, for it totters. You've made your people see hard things. You have given us wine to drink that made us stagger. You have set up a banner for those who fear you, that they may flee to it from the bow, that your beloved ones may be delivered. Give salvation by your right hand and answer us." I just thought that was like a powerful thing. You can see that the psalmist is really just his grief that he's feeling, this overwhelming that he's feeling. Sure. But he uses that to press in to say, and trust in the sovereignty of God, to say, God, restore us.
That's great.
And, answer us. Another thing, too, this to maybe kind of add in is, I also kind of was talking through, Kelly and I were on a walk yesterday, and we were talking just about some of the things we were feeling. And she's like, I just feel like I'm so discouraged with a lot of stuff. And she's like, I just don't even know what to think or pray sometimes. And I told her, you said, do you ever think God can maybe just help our country, restore us, turn us back around? And I said, well, yeah, he's done it with a lot of people. And I said, think about, for example, the Ninevites. In the book of Jonah, they were very wicked people that did horrible things. But yet, one of the things you can see is that God turned them completely around between all the murder and everything that they did, and just instantly through one preacher in Jonah.
Yeah, that's great. Tell her to pray that have mercy on us, Lord, in prayer. If you have mercy on the Ninevites, surely you can have mercy on America, right?
Yeah, and I think that's, so we've actually this morning, we kind of committed to tell each other when we start feeling discouraged, say, hey, remember Nineveh.
Remember the Ninevites. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Hey, let me ask you a final question here. We need to wrap up. Just Mr. Floyd, Dr. Floyd wrote a book about how to pray. We're not going to give you time to write a book, but could you give some final words of counsel about prayer? Maybe it's something we've covered in the book, or maybe it's not, but just your own personal words of counsel to those watching the live stream about their prayer lives.
I would just say, I guess if I could say anything, is I would really encourage you, pray bold things. I think so many times that, when we pray, like we need to ask really bold. Like, for example, the Bible says, ask, seek, and knock. It's kind of seen in Matthew 7. Ask, seek, and knock, and God will open. God is the one who can open the door. And also the Bible says in Matthew 2 that the Lord loves to give good gifts to his children. And so I would just really encourage you to pray bold things. I think, when I pray, like, for someone who's sick, for example, I just come around and say, Lord, heal them. And I guess I don't really seem to move more towards the if it be your will. I just ask it because in my mind, I'm trusting that God is a sovereign God, and I'm trusting him to be a good father and give good gifts. And now, so if he's a good father who gives good gifts, now what I consider to be good may not be his. And so, I may be asking him for fried chicken and French fries, and that might be good temporarily, but long term, that's going to make me fat and unhealthy. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to trust him to give me, a good salad. Even if I think I'm asking for the right thing, but maybe I'm not. So I did just go and ask God for bold things, and then if he doesn't give you what you asked for, just trust that he's giving you the best thing because he is a good father. And so there's been times in my life where I felt like that's too much to ask for the Lord, and I felt deeply convicted by that later on. And it's kind of like if a child goes and asks their father or mother, would you make me a sandwich? I'm hungry. Now, I mean, they don't say is it okay, or if it's okay, right, or if it be your will. They just say, right, make me a sandwich. And even if the parents don't make them a sandwich, maybe they get a cheese stick or maybe they get something else. Their needs are going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Parents. And God so much more so, than even us. And so I guess that's kind of my encouragement, is just don't worry about, asking too much or putting it on the line and putting God to the test, quote unquote. Just really pray about it.
Yeah. But don't pray for the French fries, the salad, or the sandwich when you're fasting. Right?
No, don't do that.
That would totally blow the fast thing. So don't put those together. But thank you, Matt. We got your point. Pray boldly, ask great things of God, expect great things of God. So there we are. This is week 11 in our study, a live stream, joined by Matt Elmore. Appreciate you joining us, Matt. Next week we'll be back and we'll begin to look at some barriers to prayer for the 3 successive weeks, barriers to prayer next week. We thank Matt for joining us, and I pray that you'll continue to grow as you learn how to pray.